Okay, so we didn't really get to talk nearly enough about all of the influential people who have made psychology what it is today. Not even like we didn't even touch upon all of the historical figures, but that's a separate class on its own. So for now, we're going to jump into historically the three influential approaches that have made psychology closer to what it is today. So let's start with the first one, which is Gestalt. This is another German word, and I'm trying to say it as correctly as I can. You know, leave me a note if I'm not, but Gestalt. So what it means is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we were talking about Wilhelm Wundt, when we were talking about Titchener, and we were talking about Margaret Washburn, we were looking at people who studied the human mind and behaviors in ways that were very compartmentalized. So this one experience made you see it this way. This one thing, this one part of you makes you who you are, which we don't really see things in that way anymore. So Gestalt, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is looking at the person as a or animal as an organized whole. So this goes completely against structuralism, and it was founded by Max Wertheimer. Wertheimer studied sensation and perception. Sensation and perception is, I believe it's chapter 3. And he really wanted to show that you can't just take a person or an animal and say that this one experience made them exactly who they are today. We have to look at the person as a integrated or a person who is made up of all these different parts of themselves rather than just this one thing, this one event, this this one gene. Gestalt ideas are now part of what is known as cognitive psychology, which we are going to talk about when we get into the subfields of psychology later on in this chapter. And cognitive psych, we're really looking at the mental processes, but also there's a lot of biology involved in it. So when I was getting my bachelor's at UC Irvine, there's two different schools of psychology. There's cognitive psych and there's psychology and social behavior. I am trained as a behaviorist. Even when I became a therapist, I was a behaviorist. Within these last 5 or so years, I've been looking a lot more into the field of cognitive psychology, and this is really where it's at these days. So we're really looking at mental processes, we're really looking at thinking, remembering, brain structure, all these things, which brain structure is more part of biology, but biopsych is part of cognitive psychology. Talk more about that later. If you have the book or even the digital version, you'll see these on the screen. I don't know where the screen is. Is it this way or that way? Wherever it is, you'll see this circle, but technically what you see are a bunch of dots. The way they're formed makes it look like it is a circle, but it is a bunch of dots that are arranged in a certain way. This is just for your entertainment. Go ahead and take, 30 seconds to read this to yourself. Go ahead out loud. I can't hear you. Maybe somebody at home can, but go ahead and try. How was that? So actually, about 70% of you will have been able to read this on your own. You should have noticed that none of the letters, except for the first and last ones, are in the right place. Now, if this was difficult for you to read, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It just means the way that you've developed might not be as like certain dominant as the 70% of people. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It just means that you're meant to read the word as a whole rather than in different parts, right? So if we were looking at each letter by itself, this is showing structuralism, right? Looking at each individual letter, but Gestalt principles says we don't need to know each individual letter. We just need to know the first and the last one. They need to be the same amount of letters and the same letters, and we're going to be able to make it. Because what our brain does as we develop and as we grow is we like to take shortcuts. So if you have seen this word thousands of times, you're going to be able to say your brain is so powerful, right? So it's going to be very, very quick for us, because if we were to sit there and think every single time we saw this word, we wouldn't be able to get anything done. If you have taken the SATs or the GREs, right, that's actually for graduate school, or any of those types of assessment testing that are made by the ETS, Educational Testing Services, whom I used to work with, and they're very tricky people. Those assessments are really made to test how you test and not test what you know. So if you've ever taken the SAT preps and those types of classes or programs, they're really teaching you the shortcuts, because they want you to be able to not be tricked by these tricks that they're setting up for you, but to show that you can actually score perfect with the appropriate training, which is why I personally don't like the SATs. There's a lot of scandalous things happening with the SATs right now. I really hope it goes away. A better indicator of your college success, which is what the SATs are for, is actually your GPA, your overall GPA, because that is looking at a whole semester rather than one test that was made by people who are running a business. That was my rant. Sorry it took so long. Okay, so you don't have to write anything down for this. This is just a thought exercise that I'm going to take you through. In historical times, if anybody starts a story or a tale with the four wise men or the three blind men, who they're actually talking about are people in society, and typically it was men, who lived to an older age where they got cataracts and they couldn't see anymore, but there wasn't cataract surgery back in those days. So if you lived to this ripe old age of 40 or 50 or 60, then you had a lot of life experience and you were a survivor and were wise, considered very, very knowledgeable. That's where those stories come from. Today, our longevity is way different. We're living, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100. So these are different times. And I can tell you, I've already had cataracts at the ripe old age of 25. So technically, I could possibly be a wise person as well. Let's get back to the story. So there were four wise men, and meaning they were blind, and they were each told to touch this certain object, right? So if we're talking about objective introspection, the way that Wundt would do it in his laboratory, right, what is it? And they would touch this object. It was all the same object, but the first one said it's massive, it's immovable like a tree trunk, and that's how he described it. The second wise man said, I don't know what you're feeling, but what I feel is solid. It's almost like glass. It's smooth, but it's not something that is massive. Wise man number 3 said, this is flexible. This is large. It's flat. It's kind of like a giant tree leaf, like one of those Jurassic Park tree leaves. This is not massive. It's not solid like glass. This is something that is flexible, what I'm feeling. The fourth one said, no, this object that I'm feeling is like a snake. It's movable yet firm. If you've heard of this before, then you probably already know the answer. But if not, I'll let you think about it, and then I'm just going to tell you. So maybe you guessed correct. This is the elephantine problem. So what they all felt was an elephant, but they all felt different parts of the elephant. So the first wise man felt the massive foot and the leg. This felt like a tree trunk. The second wise man felt the ivory tusk. So it's smooth, but it's not massive like the legs. The third one felt the floppy ear, it felt like a giant tree leaf, and the fourth one was feeling the trunk, like a boa constrictor, right? Kind of like a snake, movable yet firm. And this is Lucky. So this was an elephant that I met in Cambodia, and Lucky doesn't have its ivory tusk anymore. Lucky was rescued, but the whole point of Gestalt principles is you cannot see the whole picture of a person or an animal unless you, or even the mind, unless you take all the experiences, all the parts of that person and put them together. So not structuralism. That's why structuralism died out, but functionalism, right? why all these parts make that animal or that person the way that we are today. The second influential approach is called psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is the therapy and the theory that has been developed by the work of Sigmund Freud. If you've ever heard of Sigmund Freud, I do have a lot of people on day one guessing that Sigmund Freud is the father of psychology. No, according to lecture, right? And I'm saying this because this is probably going to be a test question. According to lecture, who is the father of psychology? Aristotle, right? Your book says Wilhelm Wundt, but in my class it's Aristotle and not Sigmund Freud. So psychoanalysis is based off of insight therapy. And the type of therapy that's insight therapy is, I know what's wrong with you. You're too far in yourself to really see what is going on with you, but I'm the expert, and since I'm not in your shoes, I can tell you what's going on with you. That's insight therapy. All right, so specifically, Freud was treating fear and anxiety. So when we talk about these historical figures, some of this can sound very strange and very out there, but you have to put yourself in the position of the clinician. Sigmund Freud lived in Victorian ages in Vienna. In the Victorian ages, one word typically comes to mind. This is the era of Queen Victoria, and it was very conservative, very repressed. So keep that in mind as we talk a little bit more about him. So he was a neurologist, so he was actually a medical doctor. He got his doctorate in medicine, and he started seeing a lot of patients who suffered from nervous disorders. At the time, they were called nervous disorders, but today we would call it anxiety disorders, we would call it stress-related disorders, we could call it schizophrenia, we could call it mood disorders, but in those times, nervous disorders stood for all of these different types of disorders that fell under that realm. Basically, the person physically looked okay, physically was healthy, but mentally something was going on. So there's no apparent physical cause. In these times, Freud proposed that there is an existence of an unconscious mind, something that we're not aware of. This is where we push those thoughts that are threatening to us and our desires all the way down. These repressed urges, when they're pressed all the way down, when they try to surface, they lead to these anxieties, these nervous disorders. Stressed the importance of early childhood experiences and sexual desires. Remember that Freud lived in the Victorian era, so in these times, I'll tell you just how conservative it is. If you saw both female and male clothing, everything was buttoned all the way up, all the way to the neck, and your dresses or pants were all the way to the floor, covering every piece of skin, right? So if you were showing some leg, if you were showing an ankle, then you were a scandalous person, right? You were not a person of high society. You were a hussy, right? You were not acceptable. That's how conservative these times were. Freud is saying that you couldn't even talk about a person's body part because that would allude to skin, which would allude to sex. So if you wanted to talk about a person's leg because it was injured or you fell or something like that, you would actually have to say, you couldn't even say the word leg. You would have to say something like the limb underneath the tablecloth, right? And actually a student told me this fact, but in this time, those grand pianos would actually have the entire piano covered, especially the legs too, because they looked so much like people's legs, and that was sexual, and that was not appropriate. So these are the times that we're talking about, and that's why Freud's ideas kind of sound a little bit out there. They sound a lot bit out there, even for our time too. And that's psychoanalysis. So we will talk more about Sigmund Freud in future chapters, but we're going to move on to the next slide. Behaviorism is this third approach. I spoke a little bit about behaviorism probably a few minutes ago, letting you know that that's what I did. And behaviorism was really born to combat all of that psychobabble that Freud and other types of psychic phenomenon and people who would just read other people based off of energy or trick others. And we really wanted to make psychology a legitimate science. And the way that you do that is through focusing on observable behavior only, right? We have to directly see and measure what is going on in terms of human behavior and mental processes, except it's very hard to see and measure mental processes. There are geniuses in the field who have figured out ways to measure things like motivation and happiness and memory, but for traditional behaviorism, we only really look at those outward, overt behaviors that I can see and measure. For instance, today is a strange day. So it's a hot day. It's like 92 degrees outside right now, Southern California. So it's 92 degrees, and if I was to ask you, do you feel cold right now? And you said no, right? I would have to find a way to measure that. And the way I might measure is by seeing, okay, how many goosebumps do you have in your arm? Or how many hairs do you have sticking up? And I would count and I would measure and I would say, well, you say you're not cold, but you actually have, 5 hairs on your arm sticking up. So if it's between 0 and 3, you're not cold. If it's between 4 and 6, then you're cold. If it's between 7 and 10, then you're freezing, right? That's how we go in and we measure to make sure that everyone that we can actually see something measurable, right? Because the way that I feel cold and the way that you feel cold might be different, and that's just too hard to measure unless we have something strictly in place, a standard to go by. So this is proposed by Dr. John B. Watson, and before we talk about Watson, we have to talk about Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov is a very important person, especially to behaviorism, especially to the type of therapy that I do. Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist. He did not start off as a psychologist. What physiologists do is they study the inner workings of the body. And what Pavlov was interested in was digestion. So, can I get a volunteer to come to my laboratory and I'll give you some food, but you have to sit there after you eat it, digest it, and then defecate so that I can measure how that worked, how long that took, and all of that. Not a lot of people would be down for that, even back in those days, even today. So he did his studies on dogs. So what he would do is he would give the dog some food, the dog would eat the food, and then that would be it. He would measure the digestion process. After a while, Pavlov actually started noticing that when his lab assistants wearing a white coat went into to just check on the dogs one day without giving him the dogs any food, Pavlov noticed that the dogs started salivating. That's not normal because you're not supposed to salivate unless you're going to eat food. The reason we salivate is for our body to get ready to eat, and whatever hits our mouth, the saliva will break down those foods in order to help us digest it later on in the bottom of our digestive tracts. He was like, this is really strange. Why are they salivating when there's no food? And so he put all of his digestion studies aside and decided that he wanted to study reflexes. This isn't something that is naturally occurring. He set up an experiment, and his experiment went a little like this. Maybe you've heard of it before. I'll just remind you. So he had a bell. He rang the bell, gave the dog food. The dog would salivate, right? Ring the bell, gave the dog food, salivate. Bell, food, salivate. Bell, food, salivate. Over and over and over again. Pretty soon, when he just rang the bell, he noticed that the dog would salivate. And the more times that bell and the food were paired, the more the saliva would happen, right? So if there were something like 16 to 17 pairings, the dog would pretty much be drooling, like gobs of drool just coming down all over the floor. I usually do this in class, but I give an extra credit point. I know, I'm sorry, I can't do this right now, but try salivating right now on cue. Nobody's looking unless you've got like a family member, a roommate, or a friend, or whoever that's around you, and try doing it. You can't do it, right? Because it's actually, I've had about 4 students over the last 7 years who could do it, and I did give them extra credit for that. All right, so it's possible, but when I asked all 4 of them said, I thought about something really tasty, or I thought about something really sour. And that was what they had to do in order to get that saliva. And I gave them like 10 seconds. I'm like, okay, 10, 9, 8, right? So you're not really supposed to be able to do that on cue. Well, Watson saw this and was like, that's interesting, but I don't care about saliva. I don't care about digestion. I care more about, can we learn? Can we be conditioned to fear things, right? Can we develop phobias, right? Is that where it comes from? Because when we're born, we're not really born to be afraid of a lot of things, except for things like loud noises and getting hurt, things like that. If you hear a firecracker go off, that's kind of alarming, right? Especially if you weren't expecting it. That is a normal reaction. So what John B. Watson did is he put out a university study for a baby to come be part of his study. And little Albert was 9, 10 months old, and that's not his real name. We always protect the clients. Little Albert and his mom, the university wet nurse, had come in, and she was like, I have my baby. Like, sure, like, you can do your studies on my baby. And he had little Albert kind of playing, and he gave little Albert some toys, took the toys away, gave him the toys, took the toys away, gave him a white rat, and took the white rat away, gave him the white rat, and then behind Albert, he goes, bang! I know the sound cut out, so it wasn't really that loud, right? And what do you think little Albert did? He started crying, right? Before that loud bang, little Albert was totally fine with the mice, like, oh, this is so cute, it's so fluffy, right? Totally fine with it. He did it again. So play with the white rat, bang, right behind. It was actually, I believe it was a pot and pan behind little Albert. It scared him. Not only that, he took it a step further and then brought a white bunny rabbit. Once little Albert saw that, totally scared, freaked out, crying. Not only that, this guy puts on a Santa Claus mask, the white fluffy beard, puts his face in front of little Albert, and little Albert freaks out. So he realizes that that fear reaction that he got from that white rat, it generalized over to the bunny rabbit and even a Santa Claus face mask, which I'll show you a picture of in a future chapter when we talk a little bit more about this. So really, he was looking at phobias and how we learn to be afraid. Even if you put a baby in a position where there is a table, a ledge, and then there's glass, so it looks like the baby might fall, usually very early on, the baby's going to keep crawling. It's not until we go, wait, stop, or we scare the baby will stop in its tracks. That's all behaviorism because we're talking about conditioning. Conditioning means training the person to come up with a new type of behavior. Okay, we'll talk more about that. So that was the case of little Albert. The horror story here is this is totally unethical and we cannot do this today. There's actually 2 different stories. So John B. Watson didn't actually ever follow up with what happened to little Albert. And there are people who tried to track down little Albert and his mom, people who fit the description of the baby and the university wet nurse at the time. And one of the studies that I found said that little Albert was actually a child who passed away at the age of 6 due to neurocognitive problems. We don't know if that's completely true or not, but somebody who matched the description of little Albert and his mom, that may have happened, and we don't know if that's directly the cause of Watson or if it was a completely different person in general. So This was when psychology was, we didn't really have a lot of rules in place. We didn't have ethics committees, but we'll talk about more about that next week in part 2 of this chapter. So Mary Cover Jones, I just add her in because not only is she awesome and an early pioneer in behavior therapy, she did a little Peter experiment. I know what you're thinking, but no. She chose a child who already had a fear and applied desensitization, which is trying to counter condition or help that child who had that fear make that fear go away. Right, so that's the good part of this.